An elderly mother visited her son seeking help, hoping to reconnect. But what she discovered upon opening the door changed her life forever. Mary woke up before the first ray of sunlight touched the horizon. Through the window of her small adobe house, the outlines of the mountains surrounding the village were barely visible. The fresh morning air filtered through the cracks, and the distant sound of roosters signaled the beginning of another day. She was already used to waking up at this hour, as she had done for the past years of her life. Time and circumstance had taught her that each new dawn brought its struggles, but also the possibility of a small victory. With her rough, tired hands from years of work, Mary lit the old wood stove that took up the only wall in the kitchen. The crackling sound of the burning wood was familiar, almost comforting. While waiting for the fire to catch, she went out to the small garden, which, despite her best efforts, never produced enough to meet her needs. Weeds grew untamed between the vegetables, and the flowers that once brought joy to the place were now wilted and forgotten. But Mary never complained. That garden, though neglected, was the refuge where her soul found peace, and her work there connected her to the land that had been a part of her life for as long as she could remember. The sunlight began to filter through the clouds when Mary returned to the kitchen, where her adopted granddaughter Lucy was still asleep. Lucy was only 16, but her energy and curiosity about life gave her a vitality that contrasted with Mary's serenity. Mary had found her when she was just a child, during a time when both their lives seemed trapped in a spiral of difficulties. But Lucy, despite everything, had grown surrounded by love and care, and her spirit filled with dreams was a beacon of hope for Mary. Softly, Mary approached Lucy's bed and stroked her hair. The young girl woke up at the touch of her grandmother's hand on her head, and still half asleep, smiled at her. "Good morning, Grandma," Lucy said with a warm voice, still full of sleep. "Good morning, my child," Mary replied, with a calm smile that couldn't hide the worries lurking in her heart. The morning routine unfolded in silence, with the softness of everyday gestures. Mary prepared breakfast, while Lucy organized the few kitchen utensils they had. There was a simple harmony in their home, even though economic difficulties were always present, like silent shadows sliding along the walls. Lucy was all that remained for Mary from the happy days she had shared with her son Jacob, the boy who, after so many promises of a better future, had left for the city over 10 years ago. As they sat down at the table, Mary drifted into her thoughts. She remembered the days when Jacob, as a young man, dreamed of leaving the village to find a better future in the city. It had been a difficult decision for him, but one his mother had accepted, as mothers always do, out of love for their children. The letters that arrived at the beginning of his departure gradually became less frequent until they stopped altogether. The pain of hearing nothing from him, not receiving a single word, was a burden Mary carried in her heart. "Grandma, do you think Jacob remembers us?" Lucy asked, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. Mary lifted her gaze and looked at Lucy with a mix of sadness and love. Her eyes, wrinkled from years of struggle, couldn't hide the pain she felt from her son's absence. "I don't know, child. I haven't heard from him in a long time. But I've always thought that, even if he doesn't write to us, he carries everything we've lived in his heart. Life in the city. It's very different, isn't it?" Lucy nodded slowly, understanding what her grandmother meant. She knew that Jacob's world was another, very different from hers and Mary's, a world filled with noise, commitments, and luxury, which seemed to draw him further from his humble roots. After breakfast, Mary went to the market, as she did every day. Her steps were firm, and her face, though marked by time, reflected a serenity that only those who have lived intensely can possess. At the market, people greeted her with familiarity. They had known her forever. Her life, though modest, was marked by dignity. Sometimes conversations with neighbors turned to Jacob, and Mary, with a wistful smile, always answered the same. He went to the city to find a better future. It was her way of holding on to hope, of believing that someday Jacob would return, or at least send news. But over the years, waiting had become more than just an act of faith. It was a necessity, a way of holding life together amid so many hardships. Throughout the day, Mary sold the few vegetables she had managed to harvest, but the money barely covered the most basic expenses. The sale of the vegetables gave her just enough to survive, but not to get ahead. Lucy had grown up with the hope of a better future, of a life different from the one her grandmother had known. But the weight of poverty was something they both shared, with a quiet resilience that kept them united. At the end of the day, when the sun had already set behind the mountains and the sky was tinged with orange hues, Mary returned to her little house. As she approached home, she saw Don Evaristo in the distance, a man who, despite his kindness, had always made her feel uneasy. He stood in front of her door, as if he had been waiting for her. Mary felt a slight apprehension. Something in his attitude unsettled her, but she decided to approach. When she got close to him, Don Evaristo, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, began to speak in a soft but firm tone. "Mary, I bring you bad news," he said without preamble. "The money you invested in the agricultural business, it's gone. The business has failed, and there's nothing you can recover." The news hit Mary like a heavy stone. Not only had she lost the money, but also the security the business had given her. Now she felt the ground beneath her feet crumble. What was left now? How could they move forward? As Don Evaristo walked away, Mary stood still, staring at the little house she had built with so much effort. Her hands, once firm and secure, now trembled. She didn't know how to react, but something inside her, perhaps a last spark of hope, told her she couldn't give up. She had to find a way to save her home and Lucy. But how? She looked up at the sky, searching for an answer, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Mary, looking at her house, knowing life was about to change irrevocably, and realizing that, to save the little they had left, she had to make a choice. Go to the city to find Jacob, or stay and face adversity alone. The sun began to rise over the horizon, bathing the small village in a warm, golden light. Mary woke up, as she did every morning, to the sound of birds singing from the nearby trees. It was early, but her mind was far from the peace that her surroundings offered. The news of Don Evaristo's betrayal continued to swirl in her head, and even though she had tried not to think about it, the weight of the uncertainty was hard to ignore. She had lost so much in recent years, but the constant thoughts of her son, Jacob, consumed her in a way that even life's hardships couldn't extinguish. Lucy, as always, woke up shortly after her. The young girl had that natural light, which gave her an energy that seemed inexhaustible, and every morning brought with it a fresh air of hope. Mary watched Lucy as she got up and began her routine, with bright eyes full of dreams, so different from those of her mother. The contrast between them was evident. Mary was the woman who had lived a life of sacrifice, while Lucy still saw the world with an innocent gaze full of possibilities. Today, however, Lucy's smile wasn't enough to ease Mary's worries. As she prepared breakfast, her thoughts slid toward her son, as always. Jacob. What had become of him? Was he okay? Mary thought of him often, of the promise he had made to go to the city to find a better future, a future that he had never shared with her, but one she had always hoped for. The first years after his departure had been painful, but at least there had been letters. At first, the letters arrived frequently, each one detailing the city, new friends, opportunities. But then, the correspondence gradually decreased, with fewer words and more excuses, until the letters stopped arriving altogether. Over the years, Mary had learned to resign herself, to accept that perhaps the distance, the commitments of modern life, and Jacob's need to forge a new path had permanently pulled him away from her. Yet, deep in her heart, there was always a spark of hope, a small light that couldn't be extinguished, telling her that her son, in some corner of his life, still thought of her. "Grandma, can I help?" Lucy interrupted Mary's thoughts with the soft voice she always had in the mornings. Mary looked at her fondly and nodded. Although her life was marked by loneliness and hardships, having Lucy by her side gave her the strength to keep going. Lucy, for her part, felt that her grandmother was the most important person in her life. She grew up with the hope of finding a way out of the poverty surrounding them, but her love for Mary had always been stronger than any material dream. Over breakfast, Mary and Lucy talked about everyday things. Lucy mentioned that she had seen a stall at the market selling old books, and although they knew they didn't have money, Lucy's eyes sparkled with excitement at the idea of reading something new. Mary smiled, knowing that those small moments of happiness were what kept the flame of hope alive. Yet, something deep inside her told her that soon things would change, that time was running out for them to stay in their little world. After breakfast, Mary took one of the letters she still kept from Jacob. It was folded, with the corners worn from the passing years. She read it aloud, as if doing so could bring her closer to him. The letter was from 6 years ago, when he still wrote often. He spoke of his life in the city, how busy he was, and the projects he was working on. But there was something in the words that conveyed a silent pain, something that told Mary that her son was beginning to distance himself not only from her life, but from everything he had once been. "My dear mother," Mary read quietly, "the city is big and full of opportunities. There is much to do here. I don't know when I'll be able to visit, but I hope everything is well there. I always think of you." The end of the letter always gave her a strange feeling, a knot in her stomach. "I always think of you." The phrase hung in the air like an unfulfilled promise. Mary, her eyes clouded with nostalgia, carefully put the letter away, as if it were the last trace of her son she had left. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves of the trees, as if nature itself was trying to convey some message to her. However, Mary couldn't ignore what her heart was already telling her. The life her son had left behind was lost in time. If anything could save her life, if she could recover that connection with him, it had to be now. If her home, her little refuge, was lost, there would be nothing left. The decision was made. She had to go to the city and find Jacob. "Lucy," Mary said suddenly, interrupting the thoughts that had been haunting her, "I've been thinking about something. Maybe it's time to find Jacob. Maybe he can help us. Maybe there we can find an opportunity." Lucy looked at her, surprised. Although she had noticed her grandmother's concern, she never imagined they would reach this point. Yet, the tone of Mary's voice, the determination in her eyes, made her understand that there was no turning back. "If we go, we'll do it together," Lucy said, with a smile full of confidence. Mary, though worried, nodded. Her granddaughter was right. She couldn't leave her behind. Together they would face whatever the future held. But there was something deeper in Mary's eyes. The idea of seeing Jacob, of facing the son she had left behind, filled her with a mixture of hope and fear. As evening fell, with the sun hiding behind the mountains, Mary and Lucy prepared for the journey. A few clothes, some food for the road, and a photograph of Jacob, one of the few tangible memories she still had. The two women exchanged a silent look, knowing that what they were about to do would change their lives forever. And though the future was uncertain, there were no more options. The decision to go to the city not only represented the search for a lost son, but also the struggle for survival, for what little remained of their home and their lives. As the sky darkened, the two women embraced, knowing that the next day they would begin the journey that could be their last chance. Thus, as night fell, with hearts full of uncertainty, they prepared to take the first step into the unknown. The next morning arrived with a grey sky that seemed to reflect the weight Mary felt in her heart. The fresh morning air did little to alleviate the unease that had accompanied her since Don Evaristo's visit the previous afternoon. As Mary and Lucy gathered the few belongings they would take on the journey, Mary's face was marked by a mixture of worry and silent determination. She knew time was running out, and there was no turning back. The journey to the city was uncertain and full of risks, but Mary couldn't sit idly by. Every day that passed without making a decision brought her closer to losing everything she had, her home and Lucy's future. Yet before leaving, there was something she had to do, something that weighed on her, that slipped into her thoughts, and, although she wished to ignore it, she couldn't. Don Evaristo had been to her house yesterday, and the message he had brought was more than just a loss of money. The man who had once been her neighbor and friend had delivered news that made everything feel even darker. The agricultural business she had funded with all her strength, the investment that had been her hope, didn't exist. Everything she had earned from years of hard work had gone down the drain of a lie crafted by Don Evaristo. Mary had trusted him, as she had trusted so many others in her life. Don Evaristo had been a man with a kind face, always willing to help others, but Mary hadn't known that behind that facade was a heart of ice, ready to take advantage of others' desperation for his own benefit. The agricultural business she had placed her trust in turned out to be a sham, a failed investment, a deception that had left Mary with nothing. The memory of the conversation assaulted her as she prepared her few belongings. Don Evaristo's voice, soft but laced with venom, still echoed in her ears. "Mary, I'm sorry to tell you there's nothing to recover. The money you invested, it's not there. The business failed, and I have nothing else to tell you. I can't give you anything back." The coldness with which he said it was more bitter than any hurtful words. Mary had felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. The anguish she had felt in that moment was unbearable. The only hope she had collapsed in an instant, and realizing she had been deceived, she felt more vulnerable than ever. Don Evaristo, noticing her shock, didn't show a hint of regret. He simply turned and left, leaving behind a trail of frustration and pain. Mary stood there, staring at the empty land that had once been the place where she had hoped to harvest more than just hope. Now, that land seemed empty, lifeless, like her future. But the blow didn't end there. The day after her conversation with Don Evaristo, a mailman appeared at her door with a letter from an institution Mary never imagined she would have to face: the bank. When the letter arrived, Mary immediately recognized it, knowing that the sender only had one thing to announce: the foreclosure of her house. While Lucy was in the garden, Mary sat at the kitchen table with trembling hands, unfolding the envelope that contained the harshest sentence she had received in years. The postman had delivered the letter without giving it much thought. He didn't even know the magnitude of what he was carrying. Holding the paper in her hands, Mary could barely believe what she was reading. The bank had declared the foreclosure due to the debts she hadn't been able to pay, a pile of unpaid bills resulting from the desperate economic situation she had been living in. The letter stated that if the debt wasn't paid within 3 weeks, the house would be handed over to another person. Mary had tried to save what she could, but with the investment in the agricultural business, her savings had quickly run out. Everything was crumbling around her, and she felt like she could do no more. The roof under which she had raised Lucy was about to fall. "Grandma, what's wrong?" Lucy asked when she saw Mary's expression as she read the letter. Mary slowly lifted her gaze, her look empty, lost in the paper she held in her hands. She didn't want Lucy to see the despair in her eyes, didn't want her to know how much the situation was affecting her. "It's nothing, daughter, just a reminder that life isn't easy." Lucy, as always, didn't let her grandmother shy away from the pain. She approached and gently took her hand, as if trying to convey all the love she felt. There were no words that could alleviate what they both were feeling, but their closeness offered at least a small measure of comfort. Mary looked at Lucy, and for a moment the sadness dissolved, replaced by a determination she had been holding back. She couldn't let it all end this way. Even if the house and the security she had built were fading away, she still had something important left: her granddaughter, and with her, she was unwilling to give up. If she had to go to the city to ask for help, she would. She would search for her son, Jacob, even if he was distant, even if it hurt that he had never returned to her side. But her mother's love would always be stronger than the wounds of the past. "Lucy," she finally said, her voice firm, "I'm going to the city to find Jacob. Maybe he can help us." Lucy, though surprised by the decision, understood that her grandmother had reached her limit. She smiled, recognizing the strength she had always seen in her. "Then we'll go together," Lucy said, determined. Mary nodded, putting the bank letter away and taking her granddaughter's hand with renewed firmness. The weight of the decisions ahead was enormous, but there was no turning back. Despite the betrayal, despite the uncertainty, life had to go on, and Mary would fight with all her strength for what remained. That afternoon, as the sun hid behind the mountains, Mary and Lucy began preparing their bags for the journey. They knew the future was uncertain, but they also knew that, at least, they wouldn't face it alone. Mary's family's fate was about to change, and their love and hope would be the only weapons they had to face what lay ahead. The next morning, the sky was covered with grey clouds, as if the universe itself were reacting to the weight of the decisions Mary was forced to make. The cool morning air did little to clear the fog in her mind. Although she had decided to leave for the city with Lucy to search for her son, the news from the bank still echoed in her thoughts. The foreclosure of the house not only meant losing her home, but it was also a cruel reminder of all that had been left behind and what was about to be lost. That morning, Mary didn't feel capable of getting out of bed. Though Lucy was already awake and preparing breakfast, Mary remained there, staring at the ceiling, her eyes fixed on a point that seemed endless. It wasn't just the loss of her house that tormented her. It was the feeling that everything she had done so far, everything she had fought for, was crumbling around her. Her hands, which for years had worked tirelessly in the fields, now seemed empty, as though they could no longer hold anything. Lucy called her from the kitchen, her voice light and full of energy, as always, but Mary couldn't respond immediately. The words of the bank's letter returned to her mind, and each time she tried to push them away, they came back stronger. If the debt is not paid within 3 weeks, the property will be transferred to a buyer. 3 weeks. Only 3 weeks to find a solution, to stop everything she had built in that home from vanishing. Finally, Mary got up with effort and approached the small mirror that hung on the wall. She looked at herself for a moment, her eyes sad but determined. She couldn't allow herself to sink into despair. While the situation seemed darker than ever, there was still something to fight for. Lucy. Always Lucy. She had raised her granddaughter with all her love, despite the difficulties, and wouldn't allow that love to be destroyed by the circumstances. She went to the kitchen, where Lucy was placing 2 plates on the table. The young girl looked at her, concerned, noticing that her grandmother still hadn't been able to shake off the unease from the letter. "Grandma, how do you feel?" Lucy asked gently, noticing the weariness on Mary's face. Mary looked at her and gave a weak smile, trying to hide her pain behind a facade of calm. "I'm fine, daughter. Just thinking about everything we need to do. It's not easy, but we can't stay here anymore. The bank, they've made their decision." Lucy nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation, though she could never fully grasp the burden her grandmother carried. She knew that, despite Mary's serenity, all of this was too much for anyone to bear. After a silent breakfast, the 2 women sat at the small kitchen table. The home they had built, as small and humble as it was, had been their refuge. But now, that security was fading. Mary sighed deeply, her gaze fixed on the floor before she lifted her eyes to Lucy. "I have to go to the city, daughter. To find Jacob, even if it's hard. I know it's the only thing we have left. We can't stay here. The house is lost. But I don't want to lose you too." Lucy looked at her with wide eyes, surprised, but didn't say anything. It wasn't necessary. She knew what that decision meant. They were going to the city to look for a man who was no longer the son Mary remembered. She didn't know if they would find him or even if Jacob still remembered them. But there was a spark of hope in her grandmother's eyes, and Lucy couldn't take that light away. Mary stood up, and together with Lucy, they began packing what little they had. At first, words were scarce, but as the morning progressed, they both knew that every action they took brought them closer to the moment of departure. Lucy packed a few clothes in a bag, along with a jar of preserves and some small items that had always been part of their life. Mary, for her part, took an old photograph of Jacob, a memory from when he was a child, which she had kept as a treasure. It was all she had left of him, and though time had passed, she had never stopped looking at the picture with love. The journey to the city was a step into the unknown. But on the other hand, it was the last thread of hope they had. Mary knew that life in the city would be different, probably much harder. But she had to try. The city was big, full of promises and dreams, and maybe, just maybe, Jacob was still there, willing to remember what he had left behind. As they finished packing, Lucy looked at her grandmother once more. There was something in Mary's face that conveyed an unwavering certainty, despite the chaos in her heart. Lucy understood that the decision was already made, but she still felt the fear, that sense of insecurity that had invaded her. "Grandma, what if Jacob doesn't want to see us?" Lucy asked, a mix of fear and worry in her voice. Mary looked at her softly, and although she knew the possibility was painful, she couldn't let fear take over them. "If he doesn't want to see us, at least we'll have tried. But I don't think that will be the case, Lucy. A mother's love is never forgotten, and I know that Jacob carries a part of us inside. We owe it to ourselves to give it a chance." With those words, the two made their way to the door. As they left their home, the wind blew strongly, as if the world itself was pushing them forward. The road to the city would be long, and they didn't know what awaited them at the end of that journey. But there was no turning back. The future was at stake, and Mary knew. If anything could save them, it would be the hope of finding Jacob, even if that hope might be fleeting. In the distance, the old adobe house with its almost ruined garden disappeared into the shadows of the evening. Mary, with Lucy by her side, began walking into the unknown with the firm conviction that, though the future wasn't clear, at least she wouldn't face it alone. That day, as they left the village, Mary left behind more than just her home. She left the life she had known, a life of sacrifice and effort, and began a new chapter, one in which only her love for her son could guide her. The sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon when Mary and Lucy began their journey into the unknown. The morning was cold, and the air of the countryside felt bitter as they walked toward the bus stop. The fabric bag Mary carried hung from her shoulder with a lightness that didn't match the weight of the decisions she carried inside. Lucy walked beside her, her expression determined, though fear and uncertainty were reflected on her face. However, there was no turning back. They had left their home behind, and now the only direction they had was the city, the place where, at least in Mary's imagination, her son awaited. As they walked, Mary couldn't help but look back at the landscape slowly fading behind them. The village had been her life, her everything. But something inside her told her that they no longer belonged to that place. As they moved farther away from the cobblestone streets, the houses with tiled roofs, and the familiar faces of neighbors who always greeted them warmly, Mary felt the weight of the farewell deepen. Lucy walked steadily beside her. There was something about her youth and her dreams that gave Mary strength. The young girl was not afraid. In fact, the only time she had shown any sign of doubt was that morning when, while they were packing, she had looked at her grandmother with concern in her eyes and asked a question that had been lingering in her mind. "Grandma, what if you go alone?" Lucy asked softly, unable to look directly at her. "I know you're strong. You've always been, and maybe I'm not as brave as you." Mary stopped for a moment when she heard those words. Lucy, always so mature for her age, seemed to be doubting herself. Mary looked into her eyes, seeing the unease hidden behind her mask of courage. "Why do you say that, child?" Mary asked, surprised, but also understanding the meaning behind her words. Lucy hesitated before responding. She knew her grandmother had given everything for her, that her life had been dedicated to taking care of her, but she didn't want to be another burden in Mary's life. At 16, Lucy still felt she hadn't found her own path, and the thought of her grandmother sacrificing everything for her hurt deeply. "I say it because you've done so much for me, and it hurts that you have to carry my fear. Sometimes I think I'm not as strong as you. You've done it all. And I've always been your shadow." Mary, hearing these words, felt a lump form in her throat. She knew that Lucy, despite being so young, loved her deeply, but also felt a sense of guilt, as if her presence was an obstacle during the most difficult times. "Lucy," Mary said gently but firmly, "what do you know about being strong? You are much braver than you think. Fear is natural, I know, but what matters is not being afraid, but knowing what to do with it. And you've done everything for me too, daughter. We've been strong together, and we will be, even in the city. So don't for a moment think I'm going to leave you alone. I don't know what the future holds, but we'll face it together, like always." Lucy looked at her in silence for a long moment, then smiled faintly, feeling the weight of uncertainty lighten a little. Despite her doubts, she knew there was no way she could separate from her grandmother. If there was one thing she had learned from her, it was that love and family were the only things that truly mattered. "You're right," Lucy finally said. "I don't want you to go alone. Let's do it together, Grandma. Together." The simple fact that Lucy had decided to accompany her gave Mary the strength she needed. Her granddaughter's love was the driving force that kept her standing, the reminder that, even if everything else failed, they still had each other. The day went on, and the journey to the city seemed nearer, though the reality of what they were facing enveloped them with a heavy air. When they arrived at the bus station, people were hurrying around, and the noise of voices and the sound of wheels on the ground made Mary and Lucy feel small. The bus they would take was old and rattling, but to them it was the only way to get to the city, the only path left to follow. Mary and Lucy sat on a wooden bench, waiting for the bus to depart. The place was full of people, but everything around them seemed blurry, as if everything was on pause. Lucy leaned against the bus window, looking out at the village they were leaving behind. Although the landscape was slowly fading, something inside her didn't want to let go. She was leaving behind the life she knew, and the future was a mystery. Mary, on the other hand, kept her gaze fixed ahead, in the direction the bus would soon take. She wasn't sure what awaited them, but what she did know was that there was no turning back. The house, the memories, all of that was now out of reach. Only the two of them remained, united on this uncertain journey. She wasn't afraid to face whatever came, not while Lucy was by her side. Finally, the bus arrived, and the sound of the engines made them react. They both stood up and boarded with the same determination, even though their hearts were pounding, filled with excitement and fear at the same time. They sat near the window, and as the bus started moving, Mary and Lucy looked for the last time at the village that had been their home. Mary felt the uncertainty of what lay ahead, but she also knew that this journey wasn't just about finding Jacob. It was also an opportunity to reshape Lucy's future, to show her that sacrifice, effort, and love were the only ways to move forward. As the bus moved along the road, the landscape began to change. The fields and small houses disappeared, giving way to grey buildings and the busy streets of the city. For Mary and Lucy, each kilometre travelled was another step into the unknown, but also a step closer to the hope of finding something that could save them. They didn't know if they would find Jacob or if he would even be willing to welcome them. But what they did know was that they would try. They would try together. The journey had begun. The bus creaked and rattled as it moved down the road. Mary clung to her seat, looking out the window with a mix of excitement and anxiety. Lucy, sitting beside her, seemed more animated. Though her face reflected the same uncertainty as her grandmother's, her eyes sparkled with curiosity about the unknown. The city, that mysterious place from where Jacob had left so many years ago, was now a tangible and near destination. But as the bus pulled away from the village, an increasing weight on Mary's chest reminded her that the life they had known was behind them, making way for a new chapter filled with questions. The rural landscape gradually disappeared, replaced by larger fields, then scattered houses, and finally concrete and asphalt. Mary watched as the small villages were left behind, and with them, the last traces of the quiet life she had known. The silence on the bus was almost palpable, interrupted only by the constant hum of the engine. The people around them seemed accustomed to the bustle of the journey, but Mary couldn't help feeling out of place in everything surrounding her. This trip, though just beginning, already represented the biggest change in her life in years. Lucy, for her part, looked out the window with interest. The city streets began to appear on the horizon, and although her grandmother didn't know it, Lucy felt a mix of excitement at seeing something new and fear about what they might find. The city was not only a distant place where her grandfather had gone in search of opportunities. For Lucy, it was also a place filled with expectations, a space where dreams and opportunities seemed possible. Despite everything, the image of her grandmother, who had already lived a life marked by sacrifices, filled her with a quiet concern. "Grandma, how do you imagine the city?" Lucy asked, breaking the silence. Mary glanced at her, surprised by the question, but immediately smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "I imagine it will be very different. Lots of noise, lots of people. We might not know how to adapt, but we have to try. There's no other option." Lucy nodded, saying nothing more. She knew her grandmother was right. If there was one thing they had learned in their life together, it was that the fight for what they wanted couldn't stop, no matter how big the obstacle. But still, the fear of the unknown made her feel uneasy, as if standing on the edge of an invisible precipice. As the bus entered the city, its speed increased, and the first concrete streets began to appear. The buildings started growing taller, the stores became more colorful, and the sidewalks narrower. Lucy pressed her hands against the seat and watched in fascination as the lights of the city grew brighter and more striking. For her, all of this was a new world. But for Mary, each change in the landscape represented an even greater separation from the home she had known, a sense of disorientation that grew stronger with each passing mile. The bus finally stopped at a busy central station, full of people hurrying from one side to the other. The faces of the people reflected a kind of life Mary didn't fully understand, but at the same time, she felt that they were part of a world where they could no longer remain invisible. Lucy was the first to get off, followed by her grandmother, who, upon seeing the crowd and the frenetic pace of the city for the first time, felt smaller and more vulnerable than ever. In the distance, the towering buildings loomed, and the noise of cars and honking horns filled the air. Mary looked around, feeling that the city did not welcome her with open arms, but instead devoured her with its hustle, its cold lights, and its indifference. The streets were full of people walking hurriedly, eyes fixed on the ground or on their phones, oblivious to the existence of anyone else. Mary tried to adapt, but everything felt overwhelming. The noise, the lights, the crowd. The city's pace was relentless, and she didn't know how to find her place in it. "Grandma, are we going to find Jacob?" Lucy asked, her voice tense but hopeful. Mary looked at her, offering a forced smile that tried to hide the fear she felt. She knew finding Jacob wouldn't be easy. In some corner of her heart, she feared that he no longer remembered what they had been or the times they had shared. But she couldn't give up, not while Lucy looked at her with hope in her eyes. "Yes, daughter, we'll find him," Mary said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly. "I don't know how, but we will, I promise." They both walked through the crowd, trying not to get lost, following the directions on an old map Mary had kept as her only guide. Lucy glanced at her from time to time, watching as her grandmother seemed to lose herself in the vastness of the city, her expression becoming more vacant as they continued. The heat of the city began to take over, and the thick summer air enveloped them with every step. Every corner, every street, seemed like a jungle of concrete and people. At one point, Mary stopped in front of a shop, observing a bulletin board with job listings, but quickly realized that wasn't the priority. The only thing that mattered was finding Jacob. If he still lived in the city, if he still remembered his mother, if he had ever thought of them. Without answers, she felt more alone than ever. "We'll ask about him," Mary said, as though the words themselves could give her the courage she needed. Lucy nodded without saying anything, but inside she was filled with nervousness. She didn't know if her grandfather was where her grandmother thought he would be. The city was so vast, and finding Jacob in it felt like searching for a needle in a haystack. Still, she couldn't imagine a future without having tried. They walked through the streets, searching for signs, asking people. The city seemed like a maze. But somewhere, amid all that crowd, there was a story that connected them to Jacob. A story that, though faded over the years, still held a tiny spark of hope. The journey had been long, but the real challenge was just beginning. The sun was setting when Mary and Lucy arrived at the neighborhood where, based on the little they knew, Jacob might be living. The city's hustle never ceased, but the energy of the metropolis now felt alien, a constant noise that filled the air, making them feel small and insignificant in the magnitude of the place they had arrived at. The chaos of traffic, people rushing down sidewalks, the bright lights of stores and restaurants, all of it surrounded them, but the purpose of their journey was clear: find Jacob. The street they were walking on began to change. The low-rise buildings and small shops were replaced by imposing mansions with marble walls and perfectly manicured gardens. The difference between Mary and Lucy's world and that of her son became more evident with every step they took. The city, once unknown, now seemed to overwhelm them with its ostentation. The air grew heavier in this neighborhood, filled with the fragrance of flowers that adorned the entrances of the mansions. Each house was larger than the last, with elegant columns, well-maintained gardens, water fountains that reflected the glow of the sunset, and wrought-iron gates that seemed to guard the secrets of those who lived there. The humility Mary had known all her life faded in the luxury of this place. Lucy walked briskly, observing everything with a mixture of fascination and fear. Though she was young, she immediately realized they didn't belong to this world, not just because of the appearance of the houses, but also because of the attitude of the people they passed. Everyone seemed too busy, oblivious to those who didn't belong to their circle. "Grandma, do you think Jacob still lives here?" Lucy asked quietly, unable to look around too much. She was aware of the difference in status, and it made her uncomfortable. Mary, who had been walking in silence up until then, took a deep breath. Though the city had impressed her, something inside her told her that Jacob must be nearby. This luxurious, distant neighborhood wasn't what she had expected, but the hope still burned brightly in her chest. "I hope so, daughter," Mary replied, her voice trembling but firm. "I don't know how or when, but I want to believe we'll find him. If Jacob is still here, I won't let him turn us away." The last words Mary spoke resonated in Lucy's mind. What if he didn't welcome them? What if he didn't want to know anything about them? The thought terrified her, but at the same time she felt she had no right to judge him. If he was happy in this life of luxury, surrounded by people who didn't know them, why would they go back? Why risk reopening old wounds? But when they reached one of the grandest mansions, Lucy and Mary's worlds seemed to crumble even further. The house before them wasn't just a typical building. It was enormous, surrounded by tall, well-kept walls. The entrance was flanked by marble columns, and a beautifully landscaped garden adorned the front, where vividly colored flowers lined up perfectly with the neatly trimmed plants. Lucy stood frozen, staring at the place in awe. She had never seen a house so big. The contrast with their small adobe home was brutal. "Is this it?" Lucy asked, unable to hide her astonishment. Mary looked at the mansion with a fixed gaze, but something inside her told her she had to keep moving forward. She couldn't turn back. Jacob's mansion was impressive, a clear symbol of his success, but also his distance. Still, here it was, in front of her, the place her son had chosen as his home. She could feel her heart racing faster, every beat becoming a mix of fear and hope. "Yes, daughter," Mary said, her voice barely audible as she moved toward the entrance. Lucy followed without saying anything, but her step faltered slightly. As they approached, a figure appeared at the door of the mansion. It was an older man, with a stern appearance, dressed in a pristine black suit. His presence conveyed authority and a strange sense of disapproval. Mary stopped dead in her tracks upon seeing him, and Lucy, just like her grandmother, felt intimidated by his demeanor. "Can I help you with something?" the man asked in a firm tone, though not rude. Mary, though surprised by his attitude, tried to stay calm. "I've come to see my son, Jacob. He lives here, right?" Mary asked, almost as a statement, although uncertainty had taken hold of her. The man looked at them with an expression that seemed to evaluate every one of their movements. After a long pause, he nodded slightly, though his face remained impassive. "Mr. Jacob does not receive visitors without an appointment," he replied, his tone making it clear he wasn't used to situations like this. "If you want to see him, you must make an appointment." Despite the awkwardness of the moment, Mary didn't back down. She felt that if she waited any longer, the fear of facing the truth would consume her. "Please," she said, her voice firm but laced with an invisible plea. "We're his mother and sister. I've traveled from the village to see him. I need to speak with him." The man stared at her for a moment, as if weighing her words, and then finally opened the door slightly, inviting them in. "All right," he said, in a softer tone, though still distant. "Wait here. I'll inform Mr. Jacob that he has visitors." Mary and Lucy stepped inside the mansion, surrounded by luxurious furniture, expensive rugs, and paintings adorning the walls. Everything there seemed designed to impress, but in the depths of her heart, all Mary cared about was finding her son. She had come a long way to reach this point, and now, standing before her, it seemed that everything she had known was fading away. The wait seemed endless. The man who had received them left them alone in a large room, with windows overlooking an inner garden. The mansion was filled with silence, a silence that felt heavy and cold. While they waited, Lucy couldn't stop thinking about how much Jacob had changed, how his life had drifted away from everything they had known. The family he had left behind no longer existed in this world of luxury. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the butler returned, accompanied by a man Mary didn't recognize at first. It was Jacob, but not the young man she had once known. The man who entered the room wore an expensive suit, his hair perfectly styled and his expression serious, making him seem almost distant, as if time had transformed him into someone completely different. When Jacob's eyes met his mother's, a shiver ran through Mary's body. In that moment, she knew the man before her was her son, but she also knew that something had changed irrevocably between them. The distance between them wasn't just physical, it was emotional, the result of the years Jacob had spent building a life that no longer had room for his mother. Mary opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The reunion, although long anticipated, was not what she had imagined. What should she say now? How could she face the gap that had grown between them? Jacob watched her in silence for a few seconds before stepping forward. "What brings you here, Mother?" he asked, his voice attempting to sound cordial, but to Mary it came across as cold. The conversation that unfolded in that moment would change everything. The silence in the large room of the mansion became suffocating. When Jacob approached Mary, something in his face reflected a mixture of surprise and discomfort, but it wasn't enough to mask the distance between them. Although his presence was unmistakable, there was something in the way he held himself, arms crossed, as if the luxury of the life he had built had transformed him into someone unrecognizable. Mary looked at her son with an intensity she couldn't help, searching, with her gaze, for the child she had raised, the son she had lost. Jacob was no longer the hopeful young man she had left behind more than a decade ago. The city, success, long hours of work, and social obligations had shaped him into someone Mary didn't fully recognize. Although his features were the same, there was something in his posture and his eyes that had changed. The warmth she once remembered was gone, replaced by a coldness that cut through her. "Jacob," Mary said, her voice trembling, unable to hold back the emotion of seeing him in front of her once more. He studied her in silence for a few seconds, as if processing the moment. His eyes, once filled with confidence, were now loaded with discomfort and something even harder to define. The distance between them was palpable, not just physical, but emotional. "Mother," he responded, with a slight tilt of his head, but his tone was distant, almost as if he didn't know what to do with her there, in front of him, after so many years of absence. Mary felt a pang in her chest. The reunion she had imagined in so many lonely nights was nothing like the one she was experiencing now. This man before her was not the son she remembered. His gaze showed no love or curiosity, only an indifference that paralyzed her for a moment. "I've come because," Mary began, but the words caught in her throat. There were so many things she wanted to say, so many questions, so many repressed feelings that she didn't know where to start. She lifted her head and looked at him squarely, with the determination of a mother who had never stopped searching for her son over the years. "I've come because your grandmother and I have nowhere else to go, Jacob. I've lost the house, the business we trusted in has disappeared, and I don't know what to do." Jacob looked at her, his face impassive, but his posture stiffened slightly, as if his mother's words made him uncomfortable. He tried not to show it, but his unease was palpable. "You lost the house?" Jacob repeated, as if trying to process the magnitude of what Mary had just said, but his tone suggested that the news wasn't surprising to him. Perhaps it didn't even seem important. Maybe he no longer had room in his life for his mother's concerns. His life had changed so much, and it seemed like those old family struggles didn't fit in his new reality. "Yes, everything is at risk. The bank is going to foreclose on it. We have no money." Mary felt more vulnerable than ever, as if life had brought her to a place where her words, her pain, no longer held value. "I don't know where else to go, Jacob. I just want you to know that I came to you because I have nowhere else to turn." Jacob's face remained impassive, but his eyes, which had avoided looking directly at her, finally locked onto hers. It seemed as though he was taking his time processing everything she had just said, but the response that came next was cold, almost cutting. "I'm sorry, Mother, but I don't know what I can do. My life here is different. I'm not the same. Things have changed. I'm not the child you knew." Mary felt a punch in the stomach upon hearing those words. Something inside her broke, although she tried to maintain her composure. The anguish of so many years of silence, of doubts, of fears, now materialized in the cold indifference of her son. "Is that what you think?" Mary asked, unable to stop the sadness that seeped into her voice. "That I'm no longer your mother? That we're no longer the family we were? That everything is completely lost?" Jacob looked away, and for a moment it seemed as though he was searching for a way out. His body stiffened, his breathing quickened, and the gestures that betrayed him showed that he was deeply uncomfortable. Though he tried to appear confident, Mary could sense the discomfort radiating from him. Her son, that child full of dreams and promises, had been replaced by a man who had chosen to forget his past instead of confronting it. "It's not that, Mother," he said, but his words lacked the warmth Mary had hoped for. It wasn't an excuse, but it also seemed as if Jacob was struggling with what was happening. He was caught between the past and the present he had created at all costs. The tension in the room became unbearable, and time seemed to stretch on endlessly. Mary tried to hold back tears, but something in her chest broke. The hope that had brought her to the city with such fervor seemed to dissipate in the face of her son's coldness. The embrace she had longed for never came, and the promise of being welcomed as the mother she had always been was forgotten in Jacob's cold words. "You look well," he finally said, as if trying to soften the blow. But the words sounded empty, and there was no sincerity in his tone. Mary closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to summon the strength to keep going. But the words that came out of her mouth, though filled with sadness, were sincere. "Jacob, I don't care how you look or what you've achieved. I just want to know if you still see me as your mother. If, somewhere inside you, the son I knew still exists. Because if he does, I want you to help me. I want you to give me a chance to rebuild what we lost. I don't know what to do with my life without you." Jacob remained silent, his face hardening even more. It seemed as though his thoughts were far away, in some place Mary could not reach. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke with a tone that wasn't rejection, but neither acceptance. "I'll give you something so you can stay for a few days, a hotel nearby. I don't want you to stay out on the streets. But this isn't what you expected, Mother. I'm no longer that Jacob, and I can't be the man who saves the family." Jacob's words pierced through Mary like a dagger. Was this all that was left of her son? The son she had fought so hard for, who had left behind a home filled with love, now saw his mother as a burden. Mary stood still, unable to respond, feeling that the love she had felt for her son had been replaced by the coldness of a man who no longer knew how to connect with his past. Finally, with her mind numb, Mary nodded. However, her heart was broken. As she left the mansion, with Jacob watching them from the door, Mary couldn't help but wonder if she would ever recover the son she had lost, or if this encounter, so full of pain and disillusionment, would mark the end of everything that had ever been. As she walked down the hallway, without saying a word, Lucy took her hand. There was no need for more words. The journey, though not over, had already dealt its first blow. Mary and Lucy returned to the mansion's garden with a mix of conflicting emotions. Jacob's reception had been cold, distant, almost as if they were not really part of his life. The door closed behind them, and for a moment they stood in silence, looking toward the interior of the mansion as if they couldn't believe what they had just experienced. What had begun as a hopeful reunion now left them empty and disoriented. Lucy, who had remained silent since Jacob had said goodbye, felt a knot in her stomach. She looked at her grandmother, who appeared serene, but the pain was evident in her eyes. Though Mary didn't say it, Lucy knew that the reunion hadn't been what she had dreamed of. She wondered if there was still anything left of the boy she had known, that boy who used to laugh, run, and share stories with her and Mary. Mary took a deep breath, trying to hide the sadness that had taken hold of her. The life she had left behind, the life she had fought to create, no longer seemed to exist in this new world that Jacob had built for himself. What had once been a warm relationship between mother and son had now transformed into a palpable distance, one that seemed irreparable. Just when Mary thought nothing could get worse, the door to the mansion opened again. This time, it wasn't Jacob who appeared, but a tall, elegant woman with a cold gaze and a stiff posture. She walked toward them with firm steps, her designer dress flowing gracefully, but her expression was one of clear disdain. Mary didn't recognize her at first, but the air of arrogance she exuded sent a shiver down her spine. "Who are you?" The woman spoke in a tone that, although polite, was laced with clear disapproval. Mary watched her silently for a moment. She didn't know what to expect, but something in the woman's demeanor told her she wasn't welcome in this place. "We are family of Jacob," Mary responded, trying to stay calm, although confusion and sadness filled her heart. The woman looked them up and down, as if trying to assess Mary and Lucy with a calculating gaze. It seemed that something about them didn't quite fit in her world. Her smile was cold, almost a grimace, as she stopped a few steps away from them. "I see," she said, as if deciding whether to continue the conversation. Then her tone changed slightly, as if remembering something important. "I'm Charlotte, Jacob's wife." Charlotte's words hit Mary like a surprise, though not completely unexpected. Mary tried not to show her immediate reaction, but the fact that Jacob was married, that he had built a family of his own, made something break inside her. Charlotte studied her with a mix of curiosity and disdain, but she also seemed surprised by Mary and Lucy's presence in her garden. Although Jacob's brief reception of them seemed to suggest that her son still had some respect for his mother, Charlotte clearly did not share that opinion. "I understand you must be tired from your trip," Charlotte said, her tone now somewhat more curt. "Jacob has offered you lodging, right? I suggest you settle in a nearby hotel. I don't want you to stay on the street, but I don't think there's any need to continue this conversation." Mary stood silent for a moment, processing what Charlotte had just said. The disdain disguised as courtesy was evident, and the woman's words only confirmed the distance that now existed between her and her son. In her eyes, in her attitude, Mary no longer had a place in Jacob's life, nor in that of his wife. Lucy, just like her grandmother, was stunned by Charlotte's behavior. She couldn't understand how a woman could treat her husband's mother with such indifference. She felt the same discomfort that Mary did, but her desire to avoid creating more conflict kept her silent. "We don't need much," Mary replied, with a calm voice, though the words were difficult to get out. "We appreciate Jacob's help, but as you know, we've come to find him. Perhaps we can talk more later, when he—" She hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation. "When he has time." Charlotte looked at her intently, as if trying to read her face. Her gaze lingered for a moment on Lucy, then returned to Mary. "We'll talk later, of course, but don't expect much from Jacob. He has his life here and—" Charlotte smiled, but the smile was tight, filled with coldness that Mary couldn't ignore. "He's not the same man you knew. He no longer has time for those things. As I said, life here is very different." Those words, so simple yet so loaded with meaning, hit Mary with full force. She wasn't just talking about her son's life. She was talking about the life Mary had left behind, the family she had thought still existed. Everything seemed to have changed, and her presence, her need for a home, seemed so insignificant in Charlotte's eyes. "I understand," Mary said with a sad smile, though her eyes betrayed the pain she couldn't hide. "Thank you for your kindness." Charlotte made a dismissive gesture, as if the conversation had ended, and began to walk away slowly. Before entering the mansion again, she paused for a moment, and in a tone that no longer attempted to conceal her disdain, added, "Jacob will be busy. Don't expect much from him. He doesn't have much time for these things." The blow of those words was harsher than Mary had anticipated. Charlotte's coldness, her indifference, made it clear that there was no longer a place for her in her son's life. The world Jacob had created no longer had room for his mother, and that was something Mary had suspected, but now felt with stark clarity. Mary slowly turned, trying to hide the pain that flooded her. Lucy, seeing her, felt a deep sadness. Although she had tried to remain strong throughout the day, Charlotte's words, the cold glances, and her mother's attitude confirmed something she had feared. There was no longer a place for them in this world. The mansion, with its tall walls and perfectly maintained garden, closed behind them, leaving Mary and Lucy in the uncomfortable silence of a city that was swallowing them whole, taking them further away from everything they had once known. Mary walked along the garden path, her steps slow and heavy. She didn't know what she would do next, but one thing was clear. What she had sought in the city, in the reunion with her son, now seemed more unattainable than ever. The mansion closed behind them with an almost deafening noise. The large wrought iron gate slid shut smoothly, marking the end of the small hope Mary had cherished throughout the journey. In silence, with the weight of failure hanging over their shoulders, she walked beside Lucy along the stone path that led them away from Jacob's house. Each step they took seemed longer than the last, as if the weight of disappointment was pushing them down. The cool night air, which had initially been a relief from the heat of the day, now felt cold and distant. Lucy didn't speak. She knew there were no words that could describe what they both felt. The journey, which had started with so much optimism, with the hope of reuniting with a lost son, had turned into a bitter reality. The warmth of their reunion had been replaced by the ice of indifference. Mary didn't want to show her sadness, even though it was clearly reflected in her face. She tried to maintain composure for Lucy, who walked beside her, her eyes downcast, avoiding looking at the mansion that had left them out. But Mary couldn't help wondering how, after so many years, Jacob had changed so much. How could a son so easily forget the mother who had raised him? How vast had the gap been that separated them for everything to now seem irreparable? As they reached the corner of the mansion, they ran into the butler who had greeted them earlier. His serious demeanor and implacable expression briefly scanned them, as if expecting them to leave without saying another word. Mary, still unable to fully comprehend what had just happened, approached him with a firm voice. "Where can we stay?" Mary asked, hoping that at least they could spend the night somewhere nearby. The butler looked at her for a moment, before responding with cold courtesy. "Mr. Jacob has offered you lodging at a nearby hotel. I will escort you to the exit." There was no warmth in his words, just a bureaucratic obligation that pushed them even further away from the family they had once been part of. Mary nodded silently, understanding there was no room for further discussion. Lucy watched her, knowing things wouldn't get any better, but still holding on to the hope that, perhaps someday, things could change. They both walked in silence toward the garden entrance, where the butler led them to the car that would take them to the hotel. The journey there was brief, but the weight of silence surrounded them, filling every corner of the car with palpable discomfort. Neither of them knew what to say. When they arrived at the hotel, the butler left them at the entrance, and with one last distant look, he left them alone. Mary thanked him with a slight nod, unsure if the gesture of courtesy was sincere or just part of his job. As soon as the butler left, Lucy sighed deeply and entered the hotel with her grandmother. The room they were assigned wasn't luxurious, but at least it was a refuge. Though small, it had everything they needed to rest: 2 beds, a table with a lamp, and a window overlooking a bustling street. Mary sat on one of the beds, staring at the light from outside. Lucy, in silence, sat on the other. They both knew there wasn't much more to say. That night, however, a simple dinner was served to them in the room. It wasn't what they had expected, nor what they had imagined when they came to the city in search of a better future, but at least it was food. Lucy watched her grandmother as she had a bit of soup, her face reflecting the same sadness that she felt. The hotel, no matter how comfortable it was, couldn't replace the absence of what they had really come looking for: Jacob. After dinner, the two of them stayed in silence. Lucy, unable to sleep, got up and approached the window. She looked outside, watching the city lights, the people walking the streets, the constant movement of a world that kept going, unaware of their pain. She thought about her mother, everything she had done for her, and what they had just experienced. "Grandma," Lucy said without turning, "do you think this will ever change? Do you think Jacob will change?" Mary didn't respond immediately. She knew her granddaughter was waiting for an answer, but at that moment, she had none. The reality was harsh, and although hope never fully faded, the truth was that everything seemed so far, so distant. The response she gave to Lucy wasn't a promise, but a reflection. "I don't know, daughter. Maybe life has changed so much for him that he no longer recognizes us, or maybe life has made him forget us. But I won't give up. If I have to keep searching, I will, because I'm his mother, and I'm not going to let him go so easily." Lucy turned toward her, seeing the determination in Mary's eyes. She knew that her grandmother, despite the pain, would never stop fighting. The strength of her love was greater than any obstacle. "I know, Grandma," Lucy said with a sad smile, but with a determination that came from deep within her. "I know, and I'll be by your side, no matter what." Mary smiled faintly, recognizing in Lucy's words the same strength she had tried to impart to her. Though the night had been bitter, though the day had ended with such a heavy blow, there was something inside her telling her that not everything was lost. Despite Jacob's coldness and the indifference of his life in the city, there was still hope. And as long as they had each other, it didn't matter how difficult the road ahead was. For now, the city overwhelmed them, but Mary and Lucy wouldn't let the world's indifference defeat them. The next morning, they would return to search for Jacob again, to try opening the doors to what seemed like a forgotten past, a son lost in a world far removed from the one they had once known. The night closed in around them, but the struggle, though exhausting, was not over. The dawn came slowly, as if the city itself had been waiting for Mary and Lucy to gather their strength before continuing what seemed like an unattainable mission. The previous day had been a trial, not only because of the encounter with Jacob, but also because of the emotional blow delivered by her son's indifference. Mary woke up early, as was her habit, and looking out the window of the small hotel where they were staying, she saw a landscape she no longer recognized. The city, though beautiful, felt foreign to her. The constant noise from the street, the swift movement of people, and the coldness of the buildings reminded her that she no longer belonged there. Lucy was still sleeping, curled up under the blanket as if trying to cling to the little that remained of the life they had known. Mary watched her for a moment, her heart full of love and concern for her. Lucy didn't deserve to be in this place, feeling lost and disconnected from everything. But the only way to find a better future, Mary believed, was to face the reality of what lay ahead, even if it was a painful task. As they prepared breakfast at the small table in the hotel room, Mary began thinking about how she would approach Jacob again. She knew their time was limited. She couldn't just keep waiting for him to change his attitude. The city was vast, and even though Jacob lived here, she couldn't keep searching forever without knowing what to do. The decision to confront him again, to ask for answers, burned in her chest. "Grandma, what are we going to do today?" Lucy asked, waking up with the same concern her grandmother had. She didn't dare to ask directly about Jacob, as if fearing the answer, but her eyes reflected the same uncertainty. Mary sighed and placed the cup of coffee on the table. Her hands, always so steady, trembled slightly, though she tried not to show it. "We're going to talk to Jacob again," she said, looking at Lucy with renewed determination. Although the disappointment from yesterday still weighed on her heart, she couldn't give up. She wouldn't. Not while her son was still close, even if he was distant. Lucy nodded without saying more. She knew her grandmother needed to do this, and she wouldn't leave her alone. She understood that the days ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that in the end, this journey was about more than just seeking answers. It was the closure of a chapter, an opportunity to heal old wounds, even if it sometimes seemed impossible. The journey to Jacob's mansion was quicker than the last time. The taxi took them once again to the imposing doors where everything had started. When they arrived, the atmosphere felt dense, as though the house itself was charged with an energy reflecting her son's coldness. The mansion, despite its beauty, now seemed like a gilded prison where the memories of a shared past with Jacob no longer had a place. When they arrived at the door, the butler greeted them with the same impassive expression as before. There was no surprise on his face, only a slight nod of acknowledgement. "Mr. Jacob is unavailable right now, but you can wait in the garden," he said, his voice polite but tinged with indifference. He didn't invite conversation or closeness. Mary stopped, looked at the butler, and with a patience that seemed to overflow from the exhaustion of waiting, replied, "No, today we won't wait in the garden. We're going to talk to him." The man looked at her again, as if her decision surprised him, but he said nothing. He turned on his heels and motioned for them to follow him into the mansion. The hallway they walked through seemed even colder than the last time, filled with paintings, mirrors, and expensive furniture that offered no comfort. At the end, in a bright living room, Jacob was sitting with a mobile phone in his hand, but when he saw them enter, he stopped looking at the screen and raised his gaze. Mary didn't know if what she saw in that moment was relief or simply an unease he no longer bothered to hide. There was no warmth on his face, only distant curiosity. "Mother, Lucy," Jacob greeted, without standing or changing his posture. His tone was neutral, as if he didn't quite know how to begin a conversation with them. Mary felt indignation rising in her chest, but she fought to stay calm. She needed answers, not conflicts. Lucy, for her part, watched her mother with a worried expression, knowing that this meeting, which had already been delayed so much, could be crucial. "Jacob," Mary began, her voice controlled but filled with a sadness she couldn't hide. "I've come because I don't know what else to do. I've lost the house. I've lost everything I had, and even though I've tried to do everything for you, for Lucy, I can't do it alone anymore. The only thing I have left is to ask you for help." Jacob remained silent for long seconds. Though his expression didn't change, his eyes showed a flash of discomfort. Yet he didn't move, didn't offer an immediate response. "I told you last time that things are not like they used to be," he finally said, his tone slightly colder. "I have my own commitments here, and my life doesn't have room for all of that. It's not that I don't want to help, but I'm not the same anymore." Mary looked at him steadily, unable to understand how he could be so distant, how he could keep saying these words without feeling the slightest remorse. The patience she had shown up to that point began to fade, but there was still something inside her that wouldn't give up. Even though Jacob was no longer the son she had known, he was still her son. "I'm not asking you to change, Jacob," Mary said, her voice firm but filled with pain. "I'm asking you not to leave me alone. That, at least for once, you think about what we were. About what we were. I don't want to lose you, not after everything I've done for you." Lucy, who had been silent until then, felt something in her chest break. She couldn't understand how her uncle could be so cold, so distant, with a woman who had given everything for him. Finally, she approached her grandmother and placed a hand on her shoulder, as if, in her small gesture, she were trying to offer some comfort. Jacob watched them in silence, and for a moment it seemed like something inside him might give way. But in the end, he didn't. He only raised his hands in a gesture that Mary interpreted as reluctant acceptance. "What I can do is give you something for you to stay the night, a good quality hotel, but I can't offer you more than that." Jacob's words fell like a heavy stone on Mary. The hope that still remained inside her began to fade in the face of her son's reality. What had happened to him? What had he done to become such a cold, distant man? Mary looked at Lucy, who was looking at her with an expression between sadness and confusion, and decided it was enough. They couldn't keep waiting for Jacob to change. They had done everything possible, but the truth was clear. Jacob no longer wanted to be part of their lives. "Thank you," Mary said, her voice barely audible. Then she turned, and without saying another word, walked out of the mansion with Lucy by her side. The walk back was silent, with the city as a backdrop, without answers and without hope. Yet, deep inside, Mary knew that not everything was lost. Despite everything, there was still one thing that Jacob could never take away from her: the love she had always had for him. The silence of the journey back to the hotel was so heavy that Mary could barely endure it. The disappointment, the pain, and the sense of failure were piling up in her chest. But what hurt the most was her son's indifference. Jacob's mansion had been left behind, a place that no longer meant what it once did. The large iron gate that closed behind them had sealed a rift that seemed impossible to repair. Jacob's life was now a mystery, a life that didn't include his mother, nor Lucy. The pain of betrayal was sharp, but there was still a glimmer of hope deep in her soul. Lucy walked beside her, not saying a word, but her eyes reflected the same pain Mary felt. The disappointment consumed her, but she tried to remain calm. She didn't want Lucy to see what was inside her, the pain that pierced her like a dagger. She had to be strong for her granddaughter, for her family, but at the same time, the fear that Jacob's doors were permanently closed was unbearable. When they arrived at the hotel, the sunset had already settled over the city, and the streetlights began to flicker on, casting shadows of life continuing around them. The noise of cars and distant conversations seemed to amplify the sense of loneliness that enveloped them. Mary sat on the bed, exhausted from both physical and emotional fatigue. Lucy watched her silently from the window, looking at the distant lights of the city as if searching for answers in that sea of strangers. Suddenly, a knock on the door interrupted the silence. Lucy turned quickly, surprised by the interruption. Mary, still somewhat puzzled, slowly got up and opened the door. As she did, she was met with a familiar face, one she hadn't expected to see in this place, but one that brought a hint of hope. "Mary," said a deep, warm voice. It was Richard. Mary, stunned by the surprise, stared at him. Richard was an older man, with the scars of time etched in his face. He had been a friend of Jacob in his youth, but after the betrayal that separated them, Mary hadn't heard anything from him. Richard, with his imposing presence but kindness, seemed to be the last vestige of the man Jacob once was. "Richard!" Mary couldn't believe it. The surprise overwhelmed her, but something inside her urged her to invite him in. "What are you doing here? How did you know where we were?" Richard smiled melancholically, as if he had been waiting for that moment for years. He walked slowly to the table, and after a brief silence, he spoke. "I knew what had happened, Mary. I couldn't stay on the sidelines. I've been in touch with some of Jacob's old friends, and I heard you had come to the city, so I came to see how you're doing, and to talk about what really happened." Mary looked at him intently, not fully understanding. The uncertainty on her face reflected the urgent need for answers. What could Richard know that Jacob had never told her? What was hidden behind that closed door, behind her son's coldness? "What happened, Richard?" Mary asked, her voice cracking with tension. Why did he leave us behind? Why did he distance himself so much from us?" Richard lowered his gaze, as if the words he was about to say weighed as much on him as they did on her. He took a chair and sat across from Mary, and for a moment he remained silent, reminiscing about the old times he too had left behind. Lucy, who had been standing by the window, cautiously approached, feeling that something important was about to happen. "Jacob changed, Mary, and I'm going to tell you something you might not want to hear, but it's the truth," Richard began, with a serious tone and a stern look. "The success he has now, his wealth, his life, he built all that on the ruins of his friendship with me. Not only that, but he used our hopes, our struggles, and destroyed them. I trusted him, and he betrayed me." Mary stared at him, stunned, unsure of what to expect. Her mind tried to connect the dots, to understand why the man she had raised, the one she had loved, had become the distant man she had met yesterday. "What do you mean by that?" Mary asked, her voice filled with anguish. Richard sighed deeply and looked toward the window, as if searching for the right words to express it. "Before Jacob left for the city, the two of us started a business, a project to get us out of poverty. We had worked for months, made sacrifices, and it had a promising future. But one day, Jacob saw a bigger opportunity, a way to make money fast. And he took it, Mary. He took all the money we had saved and invested it in a risky gamble. The company we had formed sank, and I was left with empty hands, unable to defend myself." Mary listened in silence, her face pale as Richard's words hit her hard. The sense of betrayal she had felt in her family seemed to multiply in Richard's story. Not only had Jacob abandoned his mother, But he had also destroyed a friendship of years, betraying someone who had trusted him completely. Jacob. Did he know what he was doing? Mary asked, unable to believe it. Richard nodded, but his face reflected the bitter truth. Yes, he knew. And the worst part, Mary, is that he didn't regret it. When I asked him to return what he owed me, he told me he had nothing to do with me anymore, that he now had his own life, his own interests. And he left me on the streets. I survived, of course, but it wasn't easy. Richard's words shook her completely, and the pain reflected on his face as silence fell between them. Lucy, who had been listening attentively, approached her grandmother and looked at her with eyes full of unanswered questions. So, he's not willing to help us? Lucy asked, almost not wanting to hear the answer, but hoping that something would change. Richard slowly shook his head. No, he's not. But there's something I can tell you, Mary. Jacob's success is built on lies and betrayals. And one day, all of that will come crashing down. What he has now, his fortune, his possessions, they won't last. I know that Jacob's life isn't what he expected. It's not what he thought it would be when he started. Mary remained silent, absorbing everything Richard had said. The man who had once been her friend, her partner, was revealing the harsh truth to her. Her son had built his life at the expense of others, at the expense of their trust, at the expense of his own heart. Richard looked at her with a softer expression, though the sorrow was still present. I don't want revenge, Mary. I just want you to know the truth. And if you ever need anything, even to recover, I'm here to help. You're not alone. Mary nodded slowly, grateful for his words. But the pain remained, deep and unyielding, because although the truth had struck her, it also showed her that the man she had raised was no longer the same. He had changed, and while the love was still strong, the distance between them seemed irreparable. Thank you, Richard. Sometimes the truth hurts more than any lie, but it's what I needed to know. With that, Richard stood up, and before leaving, looked at Lucy and Mary one last time. If you ever need help, don't hesitate to call me. Jacob has lost far more than he realizes, and time always puts everything in its place. When Richard left, the air in the room became denser. Mary and Lucy stayed silent, processing what they had just heard. The truth was now on the table, and though painful, it gave them a new perspective on what was happening. From that moment on, they knew not everything was lost, and their fight was far from over. The city still felt like a maze of broken promises, but now, with the truth revealed, they knew they had to keep moving forward. And even though the future remained uncertain, at least they had a direction, a new hope. That morning arrived with a strange stillness. Mary and Lucy woke early, but they didn't feel ready to start a new day. The conversation with Richard the night before had opened a wound that, although they knew it was necessary, was difficult to digest. Mary, on one hand, felt like she had received a revelation that, though painful, offered her a clearer vision of her son's life. But on the other hand, the bitterness of knowing the truth about how Jacob had achieved his success at the expense of someone so close left her with a deep sense of betrayal. Lucy, though younger, also felt something inside her had shifted. Throughout the journey, she had held on to the hope that her mother could retrieve the man who had once been her son. But now, with Richard's words lingering in the air, Lucy couldn't help but think about how distant and cold Jacob had been, how he had abandoned not just his mother, but also a lifelong friend. The idea that Jacob's fortune was built on a lie haunted them. But the hardest part to absorb was that there were no regrets in him, neither in his attitude nor in his decisions. The truth had shown that the city and power had changed Jacob in ways they could never have imagined. Somehow, he had left behind the person they once knew, and in his place, there emerged a man who had built himself upon lies and betrayals. Mary decided she needed to speak to him one more time, not just to ask for help, but to confront the truth. She wanted to see him face to face, and although the words she would say wouldn't be easy, she felt she had to do it. It was the last chance to understand Jacob, even if it meant accepting the harsh reality of what he had become. After a quick breakfast and with few words exchanged, Mary and Lucy made their way back to Jacob's mansion. This time, the air they breathed was heavy with a sense of finality, as though there was nothing more to lose. They arrived, not speaking much to each other, both lost in their own thoughts, but knowing something had to change. They had to face the truth. The butler greeted them again and, as before, led them inside the mansion. This time, he didn't let them wait in the garden, but guided them directly to the same room where their previous encounter had taken place. However, this time, there was something different in the air. The atmosphere was tense, as if something important was about to happen. Jacob was there, standing by a table, gazing out the window. He didn't turn when he heard their footsteps, but when they became aware of his presence, he slowly turned, his face serious. Mary watched him, her heart racing. He seemed to be waiting for something, perhaps unsure of what exactly, but something in his posture told her that something had changed in him. Maybe he felt the pressure of Richard's words, or maybe the uncertainty of what was about to unfold. Whatever it was, the situation was no longer the same as before. Mary looked at him intently, not fearing what was to come, even though what she would say next would be a trial for both of them. "Jacob," Mary said, her voice strong but filled with sadness. "I've come to talk to you one last time, not only for Lucy and me, but also for what we represent, for everything we once shared. I need to know the truth. I want you to tell me when we lost you, when you decided that family no longer mattered." Jacob looked at her intently, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if his mother's words were reaching him. However, soon discomfort returned to his face, and his posture stiffened. He didn't seem willing to admit anything, but something in his gaze reflected that he couldn't ignore his mother's anguish. "I don't know what you want me to say, Mother," Jacob replied, but his tone was less certain than before, harsher. His words sounded as if he were trying to defend a life he could no longer sustain. "Things are different now. I've built what I have with my own effort. There's no room for looking back." Mary watched him silently for a moment. His words were harsh, but there was no bitterness in them, only the resignation of someone who had accepted his son's indifference. The truth, however, was more devastating than she had expected. "With effort? Is that what you believe?" Mary said, a mix of anger and sadness in her voice. What Richard had revealed to her now resonated in her mind. "It's not effort that brought you here, Jacob. It's lies, betrayal, and selfishness. You left behind everyone who loved you, and don't tell me you didn't know. I saw how your life changed, how you stopped being the son I knew. All this," she said, gesturing toward the mansion, "is a facade, a house of cards that will fall." Jacob's reaction was immediate. His face darkened, and for a moment, his eyes filled with a mix of discomfort and restrained rage. "Don't keep going with this, Mother. You don't understand what's at stake. This is my life, the one I've chosen, and I don't have time to go back." Mary looked at him intently, knowing that anything she said now would change nothing. She had fought for him, but in this moment, she understood that he was no longer willing to fight for her. "I don't understand you, Jacob. I don't understand how you can say that," she said, her voice breaking. "But it doesn't matter anymore. I've given everything I could, and even though you don't want to listen to me, even though everything you say and do now doesn't hurt me as much as it used to, I know that something has broken between us. You're no longer the son I knew. And the worst, the most painful thing, is that I don't want you to be a part of our life anymore." Jacob seemed to try to say something, but his words drowned in the tense atmosphere of the room. Mary looked at him one last time, and this time, there was no sadness in her gaze, only a determination she had never had before. "I've come for the last time, but I'm not going to fight for you anymore," Mary said, without a hint of doubt in her voice. Then, she turned to Lucy, who was watching her with a fixed gaze. Without saying another word, both of them walked toward the door. Jacob watched them leave, but he didn't make a move to stop them. Mary knew the door had been closed forever, and although her heart still ached, she felt something release within her. A mother's love would never disappear, but her fight to reclaim what had been lost no longer made sense. As they exited the mansion, the cold air of the city enveloped them, and Mary realized that the path to peace, although still uncertain, now depended solely on them. The sun had already begun to set over the city when Mary and Lucy walked away from Jacob's mansion, each step they took lighter than the last, as if the weight of everything they had lived was slowly setting them free. The cool afternoon air offered them a sense of freshness, but also of emptiness. The city, though bustling, seemed unaware of their pain. Every corner was filled with people who didn't look at them, as if they were invisible. But as they walked toward the hotel, Mary's heart was filled with a mixture of relief and anguish. The reunion with Jacob had not been what she had hoped. The confrontation had revealed the truth. Her son was no longer the same, and he would never be again. Jacob's indifference had been more heartbreaking than the cold reception he had offered. Still, something deep in her soul told her that she had to continue, that her fight for Lucy, for herself, could not stop there. Lucy walked beside her, silent. Though her face reflected deep fatigue, her eyes, like her grandmother's, held a spark of hope that didn't fade, despite everything that had just happened. The city seemed to offer them little, but Lucy felt that there was still something they could do. She didn't know what, but she sensed it. The afternoon passed slowly, and when they arrived back at the hotel, they sat in the small room that had been assigned to them. There were no words between them, only silence, heavy and dense, filled with all that remained unsaid. Mary looked out the window, at the street lit by the city lights. Lucy, still full of doubts, sat beside her, gazing at the same view. "Grandma," Lucy broke the silence. Mary turned her head toward her, with a tired but attentive look. "What's wrong, dear? What if there's another way? What if Jacob realizes what he's lost?" Lucy asked, staring at the horizon with a mix of sadness and hope. Despite her uncle's coldness, she couldn't stop thinking of him as part of her family. She didn't want to give up, not yet. Mary looked at her, unsure how to respond. She knew Lucy was holding on to a dream, the hope that something could change. But the reality was that Jacob had already made his choice. Not only had he rejected them, but he had also ignored the family that raised him. There was nothing left but to accept that her son had changed, and maybe the best thing for both of them was to move on. "I've given everything, Lucy," Mary finally said, her voice filled with exhaustion. "I don't regret trying. I don't regret coming here. But I also know there's nothing more we can do. We're no longer a part of his life. And although it hurts, I have to accept it." Lucy nodded slowly, but something inside her kept fighting. She didn't want to believe it was all lost, that family no longer had a place in Jacob's world. But seeing the resigned expression on her grandmother's face, she understood that it was time to say goodbye. The night fell quickly, and when Mary and Lucy sat down to dinner, something made them pause. A soft knock on the door interrupted their silence. They looked at each other, surprised. Mary slowly got up and opened the door. As she did, she found a familiar face, one they hadn't expected to see in that place, but one that brought a spark of hope. It was Charlotte. The woman who had been so distant, so cold, now looked at them with a mix of discomfort and determination. Her face was tense, as if she didn't know how to begin the conversation, but something in her posture showed that she was ready to face what had begun to form in the mansion. "Can I come in?" Charlotte asked, her voice soft, but with a hidden firmness. Mary, bewildered, stared at her for a moment. She hadn't expected to see her. After what had happened, Charlotte no longer seemed to be part of the equation, or at least that's what she thought. Yet something in her eyes indicated that she needed to listen. "Come in," Mary said, unsure of what to expect. Charlotte entered, and Lucy, surprised, stood to greet her. The tension was palpable. Though the woman had been cold and dismissive, something in her demeanor seemed to have changed. She was less haughty, less sure of herself, as if the situation that had been created was bigger than she had anticipated. "I'm sorry for how things have been," Charlotte finally said, breaking the silence. Mary stared at her, not fully understanding what she was saying. How could she apologize after everything that had happened? "Sorry?" Mary asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "Do you really mean that? After everything you've said to us, everything you've made us feel, now you come to apologize?" Charlotte lowered her head as if Mary's words struck her hard. She didn't try to defend herself, didn't try to justify herself. She knew the words she had spoken were more painful than she cared to admit. Finally, she looked up and said, "I'm not here to justify myself. I'm not here to talk about Jacob. I can't change what has happened. But I came because what's going on, what's happening in our family, made me reflect. I think part of the blame is mine too. Maybe I didn't help Jacob understand what he was losing." Mary couldn't believe what she was hearing. Charlotte, the woman who had shown so little interest in them, who had let Jacob distance himself from his family, now seemed to be taking a step back. Was it sincerity or just another manipulation? Mary couldn't decide. "So, what is it that you want, Charlotte?" Mary asked, her voice harder now. She didn't want to hear any more empty promises. Charlotte took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to say what she had been thinking. "I want you to understand that, even though we can't change what has happened, there's still something that can be done. What I can offer you now is an opportunity for you to recover something. If somehow I can make Jacob realize what he's done, I'm willing to help." Charlotte's proposal took them by surprise. Could it be possible that somehow she was willing to help restore what had been broken? The city, the pain, the betrayal, all seemed so irreparable. But if there was one thing Mary had learned in these days, it was that not everything was lost. "Do you really think Jacob will change?" Lucy finally asked. Charlotte nodded, though doubt lingered in her eyes. "I don't know, but I'm willing to try. If there's even the smallest chance, I'd like to be part of the solution." Mary, her heart filled with uncertainty, looked at Lucy, who seemed just as perplexed by what she had just heard. Should they trust her? Was it a genuine act, or just another move to gain some control over the situation? "I'll think about it," Mary finally said, with a calmness she didn't feel inside. "Thank you, Charlotte, but I'm still not sure what this implies." Charlotte stood up, and before leaving, she turned one last time. "I just want you to know that despite everything, I want our family to have a chance. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make that happen. It's not just about Jacob. It's about all of us." The door closed behind her, and Mary stood in silence, reflecting on the words she had just heard. Could it be possible that, even after all the damage, the pieces of the family could fit together again? The future was still full of uncertainties, but for the first time in a long time, Mary felt that maybe, just maybe, there was a tiny crack of light in the darkness. What would come next was still uncertain, but the possibility of redemption remained alive. The next morning arrived without much change, but with a different feeling in the air. Mary and Lucy woke early, though both felt the weight of the previous days still surrounding them. The conversation with Charlotte, though unexpected, had left a mark. Mary didn't know if she could trust her, but there was something in her demeanor that, for the first time, gave her a tiny spark of hope. After breakfast, Lucy looked at her with a concerned expression. "Grandma, what are we going to do now?" she asked, not really expecting an immediate answer. She knew Charlotte's words might just be empty promises, but the gesture of coming to them had been different. Mary sighed, looking out the hotel window. The city continued its course, unaware of what was happening inside their walls. There was an unsettling peace within her, as if everything she had tried to do had finally hit rock bottom. But at the same time, a small glimmer of clarity was emerging. She didn't know whether to believe Charlotte's promises or if Jacob would ever change. But what she did know was that she couldn't keep living in this limbo. "We'll try, Lucy," she said with a firm voice, though her heart still hesitated. She didn't know whether to trust Charlotte's words, but she couldn't keep living with uncertainty. If there's a chance, even a small one, for something to change, we have to give ourselves that opportunity. Lucy looked at her, with a mix of fear and hope in her eyes. Though the path was still full of obstacles, she trusted her grandmother's strength, her relentless fight not to give up. "Then, let's do it," Lucy replied, with a shy smile. Mary nodded and got up from the chair. The path wouldn't be easy, but the first step toward reconciliation, toward finding what was left of the family, had already begun. Somehow, life was moving forward, though the future still remained uncertain. The only thing she could do was keep fighting, just as she always had. With that determination, they both left the hotel, ready to face whatever fate had prepared for them. The day woke up with unexpected news that changed everything in an instant. Mary and Lucy had just finished breakfast when a loud sound from the phone interrupted the calm of the morning. Mary quickly picked it up, but when she heard the voice on the other end, her heart stopped for a moment. "Ma'am, I'm informing you that your son, Jacob, has been arrested." The words echoed in her mind like a distant reverberation, yet also like a truth she could not ignore. Mary looked at Lucy, who, seeing her face pale, immediately stood up, anxious to know what had happened. "What happened?" Lucy asked, approaching her grandmother. Mary was silent. The news seemed unreal, a shock to her world, so unexpected that she didn't even know how to process it. The voice on the phone continued. "The arrest is for fraud and embezzlement. The police have been investigating for some time, and charges have finally been filed. Your son is in custody." Mary collapsed in the chair, her mind filled with confusing thoughts. She had heard rumors of financial problems in Jacob's life, but she never imagined they would materialize in this way. Not only had her son fallen so low, but his life, the one he had built on so many lies, was now falling apart. Lucy, though surprised, tried to calm her. "Grandma, this will change things, but we need to know more." Mary closed her eyes, trying to gather the strength to respond. It wasn't just the arrest that surprised her, but the idea that, finally, Jacob would have to face the consequences of his actions. Though the pain still lingered, something inside her felt that, somehow, this was the justice he had earned. "We're going to see him, Lucy," Mary finally said, her voice firm. "I can't let this be the end. Even if his life has gone down the wrong path, he's still my son." Mary and Lucy prepared for what was to come. Despite everything Jacob had done, the doors to the family were still open. Jacob's fall wasn't just a lesson for him, but for them as well. Now the future would show whether there was still any redemption left in his soul. The heavy air of the morning seemed to foreshadow the weight of what was to come. Mary and Lucy made their way to the police station where Jacob was being held. The atmosphere in the car was tense. Mary, though determined, felt a mix of anguish and pain at the thought of her son behind bars. Lucy beside her said nothing, but her eyes reflected the same concern. She knew this meeting would be different from anything they had experienced before. When they arrived at the prison, the cold building welcomed them with its imposing wall, bars, and closed doors. As they entered, the silence that surrounded them enveloped them, but also pushed them to confront what had happened with Jacob. The guard received them with a distant attitude, showing no surprise, as if he were used to seeing mothers and relatives arriving to visit prisoners. Finally, they were led to a small visiting room. The grey walls and austere furniture did nothing to alleviate the sense of hopelessness that filled the room. The door opened, and on the other side, Jacob appeared. His face, though still familiar, was marked by the stress and discomfort of the place. He was no longer the man who had set out to find his fortune. Now his eyes reflected defeat and frustration from a man trapped in his own creation. When his eyes met his mother's, there were no welcoming words, only an exchange of uncomfortable glances. Mary, who had been preparing for this moment, finally spoke. "Jacob, what happened?" Her voice trembled slightly, but she tried to stay firm. Jacob didn't respond immediately, as if he didn't know where to begin. His hands, which had always been firm and decisive, now seemed empty, aimless. "I'm sorry, Mother. I don't know what else to say," he finally said, his voice broken. "I didn't do it out of malice, but I made mistakes. I made a lot of mistakes." Mary, though hurt, tried to remain calm. She knew this moment, though painful, was the beginning of a change Jacob would have to face alone. She couldn't save him from himself. "What you've done hasn't just destroyed your life, Jacob," Mary said with sadness. "You've also broken what was left of our family. But still, even though it hurts, I want you to know that, despite everything, I still love you." Lucy, who had been silently observing, finally intervened. "Uncle, why?" she asked, her voice full of sadness. "Why did you leave us behind?" Jacob looked at his niece, and for a moment his face reflected the pain of knowing he had failed. There was no justification for what he had done, but the words escaped him. However, for the first time in a long while, he seemed genuinely sorry. "I don't know, Lucy. I don't know why I took that path. I just thought about myself, about money, about success, and I forgot everything else." There was a long silence. "Now I have to pay for what I did." The pain of seeing her son in that situation was palpable, but Mary understood that finally Jacob was beginning to recognize the consequences of his actions. Though the path to redemption still seemed long, she knew this was the first step towards something she never imagined, the possibility that her son could change. The meeting ended with a heavy silence. When they said goodbye, Mary and Lucy left the place with the feeling that, though not everything was resolved, something had begun to heal. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Mary felt that her fight for her son had not been in vain. The sun had already begun to set when Mary and Lucy returned to the village. The city, with all its hustle and cold lights, now seemed distant, like a story they had lived and left behind. The return was silent, each one immersed in their thoughts, processing what had happened. Mary, though relieved to return to the familiar home, felt a deep emptiness in her chest. The pain of Jacob's rejection still lingered, a wound that didn't close easily. Although she had fought for him, in the end, she realized that her son was no longer the person she knew, and that caused her a disappointment she couldn't avoid. When they reached the entrance of the village, the familiarity of the cobblestone streets and small houses gave her a slight sense of comfort, though the weight of reality still remained. The soft evening breeze caressed her face, but in her heart there was a sense of sadness that wouldn't go away. The adobe house, which had been her refuge for so many years, was no longer the same without Jacob there. It was no longer the house where her son ran and played. Yet something inside her told her to move on, not just for herself, but for Lucy. When they reached the house, a neighbor approached with good news. The house had been recovered, the legal procedures had been completed, and she was once again the owner of her home. The surprise took her for a moment, but it also gave her a sense of relief, though the joy wasn't as intense as before. The house was still hers, but she felt that something had changed forever. Jacob was no longer part of that life. "Thank you, neighbor," Mary said, looking at the man with gratitude, but also with a silent sorrow. Life had given her a second chance, but something had been lost along the way. That night, as they sat on the porch of the house, the fresh air and the calm of the village offered them comfort. Lucy, like her grandmother, was tired, but the sadness they both felt was palpable. The day had been long, full of mixed emotions. Mary, however, couldn't stop thinking about her son. Though she had found some peace in returning home, the wound in her heart remained open. "Grandma, do you think Jacob will ever come back?" Lucy asked, her voice full of uncertainty. Mary looked at her with a sad smile, but at the same time, acknowledging that life must go on. "I don't know, dear," she replied, looking at the horizon, where the sky was beginning to darken. "Sometimes, time changes people in ways we can't control. I hoped so much from him, but in the end, I don't know who the man out there is. I don't know if he'll come back, or if he'll ever understand what he did." Lucy looked at her, searching for answers, but she knew there was nothing more to say. Her grandmother's answer didn't comfort her entirely, but she understood that, though the pain for Jacob was still there, Mary could no longer live waiting for something that might never happen. The conversation faded into a comfortable silence as they both looked at the village lights, knowing that life would go on, despite everything. But as Mary thought about what she had lost, she also knew that there was still something important to do: rebuild her life, now with Lucy by her side. That very night, Mary went to the small plot of land behind the house and began to turn the soil. Despite the fatigue, she felt driven to start over, to plant something that would allow them to live. She knew that the vegetable garden she had always wanted to cultivate was now more than a need. It was a way to heal, to rebuild what had been lost. Although her life had taken an unexpected turn, she could still do something for herself and for Lucy. With a shovel in hand, she began to work the land, and though the task was tough, she felt there was something liberating about it. It was the beginning of a new cycle. As the stars shone in the sky, Mary looked at Lucy, who was watching her from the door, and smiled. Though the wounds weren't completely healed, she felt she could move forward. "Let's do it, Lucy. Let's start again, at our own pace. Life goes on, and so do we. Always together." Lucy nodded, feeling the strength and determination of her grandmother. Though the scars wouldn't disappear immediately, something in her heart told her that, despite everything that had happened, the most important thing was to keep going. Jacob had taken his path, but they would move forward together, building a new life. The return home hadn't brought the happiness she had hoped for, but it had offered something more valuable: the opportunity to rebuild, to heal, and to keep fighting for what was left of their family. The future was uncertain, but Mary knew that as long as she had Lucy by her side, there would always be hope. And with that, they continued working the land as a symbol of life that, despite all difficulties, could always be reborn. And so we come to the end of this emotional story, filled with lessons about family, love, and redemption. If it has touched your heart as much as it did ours, don't forget to like, share, and of course, subscribe to the channel to keep experiencing more stories that make us reflect on life. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Remember, no matter what life throws at us, there's always room for hope and the possibility of a new beginning. See you in the next story. Until soon.